Alrighty. Hey, everyone. I hope you are having a fantastic Friday. Hope you have a fantastic weekend. Couple important things before we get started with our lecture today. Number one, as you know, I am currently at the California High School State Speech and Debate Tournament down in Clovis. I wish it was somewhere else, and I wish it was closer, and I wish I could be teaching y'all right now. But unfortunately, we are stuck in Clovis for this weekend. Give us some good thoughts and give us some good vibes. Next, you have a sub. Please make sure that you are on your best behavior. If you are not, whoever the sub is will write your name down and you will come back. And if I see your name on that sheet of paper, you are gonna do a 3-minute dance in front of a class, not a 30-second dance, a 3-minute dance. So please make sure you're on our best behavior for our sub today. One last reminder, logistically, first homework week, number 14 is due next Wednesday, so April 17th at 8 a.m. Please make sure that you turn it in by that time. And then you will have our quiz today on our Jewish, Irish, and Chinese immigrants. If you have extended time, so if you have 50% or 100% extended time, you are now able to go to ARC. Please go to ARC, which is right next door. Go look for Mr. Skirvin or Ms. Valenz or Ms. Johnson. She will have a testing accommodation sheet for you. Please bring your Surface as well as a charger if you need it to take your mini quiz. So again, go ahead and head on over if you have extended time and extended time students only. If you are not an extended time student, please stay for this lecture. Extended time students, please know that you are still obligated to learn the material on this lecture. I will post this video up on Canvas in the files and send out an announcement. Alrighty, without further ado, let's jump into our lecture. So last time we finished talking a little bit about Japanese immigrants, and we started talking a little bit about the differences between Japanese women who came over as well as Chinese women who came over. So what I want you to do is go ahead and take 30 seconds with your elbow partner, and I want you to talk about the differences and similarities between Japanese women and Chinese women. So if the sub could go ahead and pause this video, let the students discuss for 30 seconds, again, about those differences between Chinese and Japanese women. Go ahead, discuss for 30 seconds. We also talked a little bit about and read an article talking about strikers, scabs, and sugarmongers, specifically how Japanese immigrants were treated very poorly on the sugar plantations that they worked at. I want you now to also take 30 seconds to go and turn to your elbow partner and discuss. What were some of the things that Japanese workers had to deal with and had to face as a result of working in the sugar plantations? Again, what are some terrible things that Japanese workers had to face as they were working on the sugar plantations in Hawaii? Go ahead and take 30 seconds to discuss what you remember from the article. Go ahead. Fantastic. I hope that gave you a chance to sort of remember some of the things we read about in the last class that we had. We're going to talk a little bit and discuss about some of these different treatments that the Japanese immigrants had to face while working on the sugar plantations. Let me just go ahead and share my screen really quickly. There we go. Apologies for that taking a little longer. Awesome. I hope everyone can see that well. If you can't, again, I have already or will post these slides up as soon as I get down to Clovis. So a couple of important things. So we read this amazing article that talked a little bit about the treatment of workers in sugar plantations. But more importantly now, let's talk a little bit about the treatment itself. So what happened to these workers on the sugar plantations? Well, first, remember that many of the plantation owners try to have a diverse workforce, right? Why? Because if we have a diverse workforce, we can now begin to pit ethnicities against each other, right? If we have Filipino workers working alongside Japanese workers and Puerto Rican workers and Portuguese workers, none of them speak the same language. What this allows the plantation bosses to do is to sort of play ethnicities against each other, right? We're going to pay the Japanese person a little bit more. We're going to pay, the Filipino person a little bit less. We're going to pit ethnicities against each other. So they're so busy fighting against each other, they're not actually going to unionize. They're not going to come together and put up a force to sort of, rebel against the plantation owners' unfair contracts and wages, right? Unfortunately, this ends up backfiring, and we're going to talk a little bit about that later in this lecture as well. Next, we see a hierarchy, right? We see a hierarchy where those who are white were largely supervisors. In other words, people that sort of looked down and oversaw the work that the Asian laborers did. So those who are white were largely at the top of this working pyramid, right? We have those who are Asian, largely Filipino, Japanese, and Korean workers at the bottom of the pyramid. They would be doing the hard work, while those who are white, American, or Portuguese would largely be lunas or supervisors. So lunas is another word for supervisors here. Next, we see that workers start working at 5 a.m., right? 5 a.m. hana, or work, right? They would work until 4:30 p.m., right? That's an 11.5-hour day, right? And remember, these workers are out in the sugarcane fields. Sugarcane, for those who don't know, super tall plant, right? You have to be bending over, right? Bending over, back hunched, right? Like many of these workers in this photo here, whacking away at the sugarcane, right? Now, I'm 24. I feel like I already have a host of like back problems. Some of you in this class like sit like shrimps right at the desk, and you might develop back problems. But imagine just working for 11.5 hours a day, hunched over, whacking away at sugarcane. That really does a lot to your body. Next, we see workers working in set groups, in gangs, right? Each gang would have a different task. For example, some gangs would be responsible for hoeing up sugarcane. Another group would be responsible for stripping away the leaves. Another group would be responsible for harvesting the sugarcane. Another group leveling the sugarcane, right? Then there were groups in factories that worked to crush the sugarcane to squeeze out all of the juice, right? People worked to dry the liquid and then process and package the sort of dried material as sugar, right? They worked in steps, right? They worked, one gang had a specific task, right? And they focused on that one task over and over and over again. This is very similar to Jewish workers, right? Who worked at the task assembly lines, right? They would have one task that they would do over and over and over again. Further, women were often paid less than men, and many of these workers, women and men, lived in unsanitary and crowded barracks. This is sort of very similar also to these dumbbell tenements, right, that Jewish immigrants would live in. And when they were living in these unsanitary conditions, right, people would easily get sick. In fact, one of the things that happened was that there was also, in addition to the hierarchy where we had white supervisors at the very top, while Asian laborers at the bottom, is we also see a hierarchy when it comes to living conditions. Many of the plantations were near hills. And when they were near hills, those who were the bosses, those who were plantation owners, lived up at the very top of the hill. They would live up at the very top. Most of these folks were white. You also would have the Portuguese lunas, or the supervisors, living right below the bosses. You'd sometimes have Puerto Ricans or Hispanic living below the Portuguese. And then at the very bottom of the hill, you would have Filipino, Japanese, and Korean workers. So again, at the very bottom of the hill, you'd have Korean, Japanese, and Filipino workers. And the problem with this is that just like, if you're at the very top of the hill, right, and you dump water from the very top of the hill, that water flows downhill, right? Well, unfortunately for those who are Filipino, Japanese, and Korean, so does sewage. And so quite literally, the sewage would flow from the very top of the hill, from the bosses, from the Portuguese, from the Puerto Ricans, all the way down to the Filipino, Japanese, and Korean living spaces. And so as a result, you quite literally have like a load of shit literally just coming down the hill that people had to live near and people had to sort of, need to sort of deal with on a day-to-day basis, right? Imagine that stench. Imagine how disgusting that would feel, right? So these individuals, right, Filipino, Japanese, Korean workers also got very sick, right, from living in these very unsanitary conditions and in these barracks. Now, luckily, for these workers, they did not take this lying down. They resisted and they struck. In fact, in 1909, we see blood unions forming amongst Japanese workers. Blood unions are just another fancy name for labor unions. And these Japanese workers protested unfair wages. They fought back against what they thought was unfair wages. They were being paid 6 cents an hour, right? At best, that's 72 cents, right? In today's money, that's about $26.77. So $26.77 in San Jose, where the minimum wage is $15, right? That's a little less than 2 hours of work. So they were protesting these unfair wages. But what was great about these labor unions, and what was great about the community, was that everyone stuck together. For example, the Honolulu Retail Merchants Association gave money to the strike fund. They saw that sometimes workers were running out of money, and so they would be giving them money to encourage them to continue striking, even though they wouldn't be making any money by not working. Further, you had Japanese physicians associations giving free medical service to strikers, right? So they would see their community suffering, right, from all these terrible labor conditions, and they would fight back. They would sort of ally together, right, stand in solidarity with their Japanese brothers and sisters and fight back against unequal treatment. This is very similar to Jewish labor unions that provided education and healthcare to Jewish workers, and also to Fongs, right? Fongs were organizations that gave social services, healthcare, education, right, helping out Chinese immigrants, right? So this is very similar to that. And the question then becomes, right, this argument is being made by the Japanese workers that this is unfair, right? Well, how do you think these strikes make the Japanese more American? Remember that labor unions are very critical to the American fabric, right? I want you to turn to your elbow partner and discuss for 30 seconds. How do these strikes make the Japanese more American? The sub, if you could go ahead and pause this video for 30 seconds while the students discuss. I hope you had a great discussion with your elbow partner. But the main reason, right, why these strikes make the Japanese more American is that striking is all about fighting for equal rights, fighting for better and more fair opportunities, right? Fighting against oppression. And just like the Americans have been doing time and time again, we see this in the Revolutionary War. We see Jewish and Irish immigrants fighting against unequal treatment, right? Joining a labor union or fighting and striking is seen as something that's uniquely American. Why? Because you're fighting against and fighting for equality under the law, right? You're fighting for labor equality. You're fighting for freedom. You're fighting for and against oppression, right? And so as a result, the Japanese feel as if by striking, they're going to be welcomed into the American fabric. And luckily for the Japanese, we see that they're not alone in this fight. In fact, we see an interracial and interethnic labor union group form. In fact, Filipino workers end up working in the exact same fields that Japanese workers did. And as a result, in 1919, as the Filipino workers were just getting fed up with these poor labor practices, they ended up striking. They wanted 3 things. First, they wanted maternity leave for women who were working in the fields. Next, they wanted an 8-hour workday. And last but not least, they wanted higher wages. Now, here's the thing. The Filipino workers strike, but they realize they'd be much stronger if the Japanese join in. And so they have an open invitation for any Japanese worker to stand in solidarity with their Filipino brothers and sisters and fight back against unequal treatment. And the Japanese oblige. they end up joining the Filipinos to fight back against unfair pay and discrimination from the plantation bosses. In fact, two labor unions, the Japanese Federation of Labor, or JFL, and the Filipino Federation of Labor, the FFL, end up combining together and forming the Hawaii Laborers Association, or HLA, right? This is very similar to a story that, another labor union that was formed between two different ethnic groups, right? The Japanese and the Mexicans. The JMLA, or Japanese Mexican Labor Association, fought back in favor of ensuring that people were getting more money picking beets from the ground, right? That they fought back against these unfair wages, right? So just like we saw with the JMLA, the HLA, or Hawaii Laborers Association, sought to increase wages for those who are workers, sought to ensure that there were more equitable and equal treatment of laborers across the board. Unfortunately for the laborers, however, we only see partial victories. What I mean by this is that many of the plantation bosses would scheme behind their backs to try and get sort of poke holes in the labor union's power. And one way they did this was, first of all, hiring scabs, right? Scabs were people that broke picket lines and continue to work even though people were striking, right? So if you can see in this picture here, we see that these are Filipino workers standing outside their place of work. And one of them is holding a sign. Are you a scab? Will you respect our picket line? Right? Telling workers, hey, you should not work for these people. These people are exploiting you. You should stand in solidarity with our other workers that are refusing to work. And so, as a result, one thing that many of the plantation owners do is they end up hiring scabs who are willing to work for less, right? Another thing that the plantation bosses do is they actually tried to bribe one of the Filipino Federation of Labor leaders to try and get them to call off the strike. Unfortunately, even though they succeeded in getting the leader, his name is Pablo Malanpit, even though they sort of got Malanpit to end up sort of calling off the strike, many of the Filipino workers still refused to go back to work. After give or take about 5 to 6 months, these workers realized that they couldn't continue striking anymore, and so they actually ended up going back to work. So they weren't as successful in demanding all of their rights or demanding that they get paid better, and the plantation bosses didn't give in to their demands per se. But what the plantation bosses did was they realized that if we continue keeping our wages this low, what ends up happening is that these Japanese workers and these Filipino workers will continue to strike. And as a result, what they do sort of in secret is the bosses increase the wages 50% in order to make sure that the workers continue to be happy and continue to be to work without striking, right? So these are partial victories, right? Even though the strike was sort of eventually broken and people went back to work, at the end of the day, they still got a 50% wage increase. Now, during their sort of time in Hawaii, many of these Japanese immigrants began to share their culture with the United States, right? So I want you to take 30 seconds and I want you to turn to your elbow partner and just discuss, how do you think Japanese workers began to transplant their own culture in the US? How do you think the Japanese begin to bring their culture over here? If you could pause this video, discuss for 30 seconds. How do Japanese workers begin to transplant their own culture to the US? Hope you had a great discussion. I'm going to toss up some photos on the board, and I'm going to hope, and I'm going to see if you can remember or try to guess what these are, right? Hope you're ready. First photo up on the board. If you guessed bonsai tree, you're correct. Bonsai trees were great ways for many of the Japanese workers after coming in from a long day of work to just focus on one thing, their plant, right? And so this was a great way for them to bring their culture over and to sort of cultivate a cute little bonsai tree in their own backyard, even though at the end of the day, they were living in very unsanitary conditions. Next. If you guessed koi, you're correct. Koi are a national symbol of Japan. In fact, this little fish right here with the red circle on top of its head is actually one of represents the land of a rising sun, right? Japan's flag, right? The big red sun. And so these fish are a means of symbolizing Japan and making it, another home away from home. Next up, this one's a little tricky. This one's a furrow. A furrow is a traditional communal bath. It's where people can relax and rest after a long days of work. Next photo. If you guessed Buddhist temple, you'd be correct. These are Japanese gardens, and oftentimes these Japanese gardens have temples in them that allow Japanese people to come in and worship, right? And pay homage to their ancestors. So this is another great way of people spreading their culture in Hawaii and in the mainland United States. Next up. This is Obon. This is a festival filled and all about remembering your ancestors. So Obon, it takes place over the summer, usually in July, sometimes in June. And during this time, many Japanese people honor and venerate their ancestors. So this is super important. This is a holiday that was brought over from Japan to Hawaii, and many workers would celebrate Obon during the summer. In fact, you can also see the many women here wearing kimonos. These kimonos are another ways of transplanting culture over to the United States. Two pictures up next. So I'm sure everyone knows the bottom photo, right? The bottom photo is sumo wrestling, one of the national pastimes of Japan. The upper photo is taiko drums. Taiko drums are basically, ways to sort of create rhythm, create music. It's also a cultural celebration that many Japanese people participate in today. Our last set of three photos. We'll start at the bottom right. Everyone knows that this is sushi, right? Delicious, amazing. Please go get some sushi when you can. It's awesome. The one in the middle is a radish known as daikon. And the one on the left is a pickled plum, or ume. Now, here's the thing. These three foods were often shared between plantation workers. So Japanese workers would bring in their sushi, would bring in some daikon, some ume, and they would share with their Filipino brothers and sisters, would also share with their Korean brothers and sisters who were working in the sugar plantations. So this became a way of not only sharing lunches and building community, but also sharing their culture and having people try out some really, really delicious foods. Awesome. We'll pause lecture there. Go ahead and take out your Surface. It is now time to take your quiz. It is now time to take your quiz. Super important. There are some instructions on the board. Please read those instructions. Remember that to get into Lockdown Browser, you need to start on Google Chrome or Microsoft Edge or whatever website you want to use, but you need to start on a browser, and then you need to transition. Click on the quiz, and then there'll be a pop-up. You can't just log into Lockdown Browser and go in from there. Afterwards, once you are ready to go, the passcode is Chinatown with a capital C, Chinatown. One word, Chinatown. That's the passcode, uppercase C. The photos also, unfortunately, don't show up on the Canvas quiz. Your sub will pass out 2 sheets of paper that you will use for questions 2 and 3, questions 7 and 8, question 10, 10 and 11, sorry, questions 10 and 11, and question 12. Okay, so they will pass out 2 sheets of paper. Please refer to those for those specific questions. And last but not least, on question 13, the last word in the question should be assimilate. Question 13, last word should be assimilate. And then also very quickly for the second question, where you see a map shaded in yellow and red, the lighter portions of the map are the ones that I want you to pay attention to. So the lightest section and then the second lightest one, which should be shaded in as the Kingdom of Poland. Good luck on your quiz. Please make sure that you submit the quiz within the time frame that you have, which is 40 minutes. Good luck.